So I really do appreciate the invitation. My dad was a professor here at Penn State quite a few years ago. That's why I went to high school here. And I was walking down College Avenue last night, and it brought back a lot of memories, very pleasant ones from a long time ago. I want to talk about the bigger issues in climate governance that we are about to face, because we basically have to deal with changing climate through institutions, that is to say, persistent rules of behavior. And one of my focuses has been on the question of institutional design. How do we actually make our democratic institutions more capable of meeting the challenges? And I think at the moment, there are a lot of deficiencies in that area, some of which were addressed in the very good panels so far in the conference this morning. So let me get to it. Some of you may have read Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, science fiction novel, A Ministry for the Future, which it seems to me is a good example of kind of forgetting about politics, because basically you face this huge global warming challenge. There's a heat bulb in India that kills, millions of people, and this motivates everyone to then do the right thing, basically. And all of the solutions just come about spontaneously, like 5 million people march on Beijing and demand that the Chinese Communist Party stop prioritizing economic growth and start taking climate more seriously, right? So how likely is that to happen? And I think that, there needs to be a much more specific discussion about the way that the needs of both mitigation and adaptation are going to be filtered through concrete institutions and how to make those institutions more functional. Climate is one of the most difficult global collective action problems to solve. I had a colleague at Johns Hopkins a few years ago who's now at the Earth Institute, Scott Barrett, that wrote a very nice book using basic game theory to talk about different collective action problems, like a meteor coming and hitting the Earth, chlorofluorocarbon concentrations, and then pandemics, and of course, climate change. And of all of them, climate change is the hardest one in game theoretic terms to solve, because the costs of mitigation are upfront and they're very large, and the benefits occur either to somebody else that's not living in your electoral district, or they happen across generations. And that just creates a very, very poor incentive structure for motivating people to do the right thing. All right, so I'm going to talk about three big macro questions, and I'm going to give you a hint at the bottom line of what my conclusion is. The first one is the issue best addressed at an international level or at a national level? And here I think that there's been too much emphasis on the international agreement side of climate, because I think the really big problems are going to be in implementation at a national level. And so we need to focus on national level institutions. The second has to do with one of my favorite topics, which is democracy, and the question of whether democracies or authoritarian governments are better suited to deal with either mitigation or adaptation. And here, I think my answer is that it is democratic governments, but there's I think a kind of wasted effort at a debate about a dichotomous choice that either you go with something like the American solution or you go with China, kind of full-on authoritarianism. And I just don't think that that's a meaningful discussion. I think all of the important choices are going to be different institutional designs within the basic framework of liberal democracy, and there's a lot of work that can be done in that area. Authoritarian governments do have certain advantages, I think, in implementation, but the fundamental choice is really not one that's correlated with regime type. And then finally, within that national democratic framework, what specific institutions are good for dealing with both mitigation and adaptation, and what are some specific ideas for how to do this? And I'm going to indulge myself in a discussion of my home state of California, I lived in Pennsylvania, but now I live in what would, if it were an independent country, would be the 7th largest economy in the world. And I think in many ways, we don't deal with these problems terribly well there. All right, so that's the overview of the talk. So let's begin with a question of international versus domestic. I think that there has been too much emphasis on the international part of it, the COP conferences, for example. I think if you look at the historical origins of that, it's basically a consciousness-raising thing. It's a mechanism for getting people to be aware of the problem of climate change and then to motivate political action. And in that respect, I think they've been all extremely successful. But I think that going forward, because of that success, the real challenges lie in actually moving from the kinds of promises that are made, those NDCs that were the subject of the presentation in the previous session, to actual implementation. And those are issues that really need to be done at a national level. It is really easy for a politician to get up and promise that you're going to be climate neutral by 2050. You're not even going to be alive at that point. I mean, there's no mechanism for accountability, when you're making promises that are that far in the future. And I think that if you can make a promise to actually change the behavior in your society in the next 6 to 18 months, that's a much more meaningful kind of commitment. And that's the sort of, result that we need to be looking at. I think that, therefore, the focus needs to be on domestic institutions and domestic decision-making. Now, facing the weakness of the whole COP process has caused certain people to double down on the international side and say, actually, the entire structure of the world, the kind of global politics based on sovereign nation states is insufficient to deal with the climate crisis, and that COP is weak, which I admit is true, and therefore it needs to be replaced by some form of supranational decision-making that gives a supranational organization real power to force behavioral change on the part of the countries participating in it. I don't know, maybe in this audience this is a straw man, but it's certainly an argument that I have heard made by a lot of people. And I think this is both politically unrealistic, and even if it were realistic, I think it would be dangerous. It would actually make the world worse off. So I'm going to make an argument for why that's true. I think that nation states remain the basic actors in international politics for two main reasons. The first has to do with power. Max Weber's famous definition of the state is a monopoly of legitimate force over territory. And that remains the case, that the political bodies that are able to actually make use of legitimate coercive force remain nation states. And that if you created an actual supranational body that had that kind of coercive power, it would mean the delegation of that coercive power to a higher level. We have had about 300 years of experience learning how to build nation states that have the power to enforce rules, to use legitimate power, to deliver services, to enforce laws, to protect the community, constrained by things like a rule of law and democratic accountability. We have zero experience in building that kind of institution internationally. So if you could imagine a supranational body that could actually reach inside of other sovereign nations and, for example, arrest a recalcitrant politician that was blocking some needed action, does that get appealed to a supranational court? Is it the result of a decision by a supranational legislature? It's very, very difficult to imagine these sorts of institutions coming into existence. But then, just as a matter of practical politics, can you imagine either China or the United States actually agreeing to that kind of delegation of authority anytime in the foreseeable future? I cannot. The second thing really has to do with this issue of a global consciousness and the scope of loyalties that people have, because I think that despite the need for greater international cooperation, human affections and emotional attachments atrophy the larger the body gets. And at the moment, it's really the nation state that remains the central locus of patriotism, of people's affection. There is a layer of people that consider themselves as global citizens, but they tend to be a very thin layer in rich countries that can afford to think in those terms. And I don't think we've really devised a way of changing that consciousness in a way that would allow a real supranational entity to exist. And so there's a desperate need for international cooperation. I don't think anybody would deny this. I think the COVID pandemic showed that we're not remotely close to adequate international agreement, because you had this kind of rampant vaccine nationalism that superseded, the real demands for cooperation during the pandemic. And that was, I think, a disgraceful failure on the part of nation states. And so that is something we got to work on. And it becomes even more critical when you're dealing with something like global warming. We're not there yet, but I don't think the solution is going to be to shift the domain to a higher level. All right. The next question was partly discussed in the previous section about whether authoritarian or democratic states are better able to deal with climate. There is a school of thought that says that the climate crisis is going to be so severe and so serious that it's going to necessitate a shift towards more authoritarian decision-making. I've had several debates with different professors around the world on this topic. The argument is a theoretical one, which makes a certain amount of sense as a theory, right? In a democracy, you have interest groups, you have the need for deliberation, you've got to build consensus, you've got to negotiate, you've got legacy institutions that are very, very difficult to change, and therefore all of that acts to slow down decision-making. But the climate crisis does not permit us that amount of time, and therefore you need to have more decisive political institutions that can make these decisions more rapidly and at a greater scale. Now, the thing that strikes me about this genre of argument is that it is completely theoretical. That, and I think some of it may be based on a kind of distorted perception of the United States versus China and which country is doing better in dealing with crisis. I'll get to that, but I think it's also completely unempirical because I think that if you actually look at the performance of democracies versus authoritarian states on climate action, liberal democracies actually do better. That was actually not contradicted by the paper that was presented in the previous session that said that democracy actually did better in terms of revising NDCs, right? That was one of the conclusions. But I must say this is something that could very usefully be done, is a more thorough cross-country study of that correlation, because it's actually a very hard one to measure. Obviously, rich democracies are responsible for the vast bulk of the carbon stock that's already in the atmosphere, because there's been this historical correlation between carbon emissions and economic growth. And so therefore, if you're a rich country, you will have emitted more carbon in the process of getting to that status. So I don't think that that can be the measure of the effectiveness of your policy in mitigating, because it really has to do with the degree to which you have enacted policies that break that link or weaken the link between GDP and carbon emissions. That really ought to be the thing that you are trying to measure. There are obviously a lot of complicating factors that you're going to have to control for. So, if you're a fossil fuel, producer with legacy investments in that, it obviously doesn't matter whether you're democratic or authoritarian. you're going to have a stake in keeping things the way they are. But there are also a lot of theoretical advantages to being a democracy, among which are accountability mechanisms and transparency. Authoritarian regimes do not have a great record at providing a free flow of information, and because they don't have accountability mechanisms, if there's popular opposition to a particular policy, there's no channels for doing this. And I think a lot of the presumption that authoritarian governments are going to do better is based on, I think, a completely mythical, imaginary authoritarian government that's somehow governed by wise technocrats that understand the science and then can translate the science into strong policies. Maybe they're thinking about Singapore, right? But they're not thinking about actual real-world authoritarian countries whose actual performance is really not that good, right? You take China. China is given credit for electric vehicles, for creating a big solar energy industry. You know, that's all very good. They've made commitments in the long run. But according to the IMF, China is probably going to be, well, I mean, on the current growth path, China will account for 40% of all the new carbon emitted into the atmosphere between 2020 and 2050. 90% of the energy projects under the Belt and Road Initiative are fossil fuel projects. They've committed themselves to not building coal plants as part of BRI, but they continue to build coal plants domestically in China. And so I just do not get this idea that somehow China is a model for authoritarian decision-making that is effective in dealing with the climate crisis. Now, it's very hard to look at the United States right now and say that we've done a great job in climate. And in fact, if you look at some of the indices that try to measure the relative performance, the United States is kind of at the bottom of the liberal democratic rankings. Something like the Climate Change Performance Index shows overall that democracies do better than hard authoritarian governments, but there's a lot of variance within the democratic camp, and the United States obviously does not do very well. There are a lot of reasons for that. I think our polarized politics, the fact that we are a big fossil fuel producer and have been for a long time, very much affects our ability to do that, but other democracies do a lot better. And as a group, democracies do better than authoritarian countries in those contexts. Finally, I would say, if you try to imagine how a contemporary democracy is actually going to move towards a more authoritarian system and how this is going to work out as a matter of the total politics and the normative values that are enjoyed in a liberal democracy, it's very hard to see how this is going to happen. Through a military coup, through gradual, encroachments by the executive on the prerogatives of courts and legislatures, it really is, I think, in the realm of science fiction. So I think that we're going to have to, for better or worse, try to figure out within that category of liberal democracies how to make those political systems function better. And I think that's where democratic institutional design comes into play. And I'm going to illustrate that. So this is the third point I'm going to make, how do actually in a democracy we make things better. And I'm going to talk about our democracy, the United States, because we are a laggard. There's lots of stuff that we could be doing that we're not. And the question is, what are the obstacles to doing that? So if you think about the American political system today, there are several categories of constraints that prevent us or slow us from actually making the right decisions on climate. The most obvious one is polarization, which has really affected almost every aspect of American governance, beginning with our ability to pass yearly budgets, which has been extraordinarily difficult. I mean, it's the most basic function of government. We've not been able to do that consistently over the last 20 years because of polarization. Polarization is working its way down to a local level. Local newspapers and local communities are disappearing and into the maw of this national blue-red division, so that local decisions on, let's say, adapting to climate change have to be taken with regard to the ideology of the political parties in Washington and not according to local conditions. I'm not going to say very much about how we overcome polarization. That's a different conference. You got to go to a different bunch of political scientists to talk about that one. But I would say that, that's an obvious, by the way, that discussion about PR versus plurality voting systems in the previous panel, the comment I would have made is that a lot of people actually blame plurality voting for the degree of polarization in the United States. That, combined with popular primaries, has meant that the two political parties have been overtaken by the extremist wings. That's obviously the case in the Republican Party, and that if you had something like either ranked choice voting or PR, it would mitigate that, extreme polarization and allow a kind of center-left and center-right party to emerge. That's a different argument, but I actually do think that some of the polarization could be addressed by certain institutional changes like ranked choice voting. But beyond the polarization, we have an institutional setup in the United States that I think is extreme among liberal democracies in terms of the number of veto points that it provides. So veto points is a political scientist's way of talking about checks and balances, right? All democracies, all liberal democracies are built around checks on executive power. And the American founding fathers devised a system, a constitutional system that multiplies these checks and balances way beyond what exists in many other liberal democracies. So having a separate presidency, separate elected presidency is one. Having an upper chamber, very powerful upper chamber, Congress is another. Federalism is a third, a very powerful judiciary that can invalidate, as we've seen, legislation is yet another. Devolution to state and local governments is yet another. These features do not exist in many other democracies. In a pure Westminster system, basically 50% plus one votes in parliament can overturn any law in the system. And it's worked, Britain worked pretty well as a democracy for quite a few decades. So we have a lot of checks and balances. In a way, I think it's kind of an insurance system. The fact that we had these checks and balances meant that during the Trump years, Trump couldn't actually get away with a lot of the stuff that he wanted to do, like getting rid of Obamacare, building his border wall, banning Muslim immigrants. All of these things were stopped by the existence of these checks. But the problem with a system with multiple checks and balances is that it not only blocks bad leaders from doing bad things, it blocks good leaders from doing good things. And so now that you've got a Democrat in the White House that wants to build back better, turns out, doesn't have the votes to get the Senate to pass it. All the blame goes to Manchin and Sinema, but it comes out of the system, right? It comes out of a system that actually does not automatically produce legislative majorities the way some electoral systems are capable of doing. And so that thing that protects you on the downside also limits you on the upside. Now, I'm going to conclude by just talking about how veto points play out in my home state of California, which is important, not so much for mitigation, but it's certainly important for adaptation. So California, in terms of mitigation, is a leader. And that's also one of the reasons I think that the rankings, the international rankings of the United States may be a little bit low and biased, because they're individual states that actually do a lot better than the federal government or the United States collectively. And California is one in terms of various kinds of emissions regulations, in terms of mileage requirements, CAFE standards, so on and so forth, right? It's been a leader actually in pushing back against some of the policies coming out of Washington during the previous administration. However, California does not do well on adaptation because it is impossible to build things in California. It is impossible to build anything in California because of a set of veto points that are built into the way that we make political decisions in that state, combined with a bunch of federal regulations that also make it different. So let's just give an example. California is completely dependent on state-organized water distribution. Basically, it only rains in Northern California in the Sierras. They store a lot of water in the winter when it snows. That water melts, it goes into reservoirs, and then it's taken down in a bunch of canals into Southern California. This is all, if anyone thinks that big government isn't important, they should look at the California water system. It would not have existed but for powerful government, not just at a state level, but cooperatively among Western states, dividing the waters of the Colorado River and so forth. But it was all the result of a lot of big government investments and plans, and that system is falling apart. We're in the middle of a prolonged drought. The variability of, well, the amount of water being stored in the Sierra, I was just there last week, and I could see this. The amount of water being stored in the snowpack has been falling pretty steadily over the last couple of decades. The variability of the availability of water is changing, and that is going to require building new reservoirs, building new ways of catching wastewater, recycling it, and so forth. Now, if you think about how do you build a wastewater plant, a wastewater treatment plant in the state of California, if it's going to get federal subsidies, it has to go, it falls under NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. The current NEPA procedure to get an environmental impact statement through is to have approximately 15 federal agencies pass on it. These have to be done sequentially, not simultaneously. And the environmental agencies were all put at the end of the process. If one of those agencies objects late in the process, then the whole thing rewinds to the beginning and you go through that entire process again, which is why environmental impact statements on average take 2 or 3 years at a federal level to produce. Then it goes to the state of California. State of California has a comparable bureaucracy, in fact, a bigger bureaucracy dealing with this sort of thing, in which you have to go through a whole set of state agencies that basically duplicate that environmental impact statement on a state level. But we have this law called CEQA that is the ultimate in what I've labeled vetocracy, right? Vetocracy is a political system that distributes vetoes so widely that it is extremely difficult to come to a collective action decision. So CEQA was passed in 1971, the California Environmental Quality Act. Like many other enforcement acts, it permits private litigation to enforce laws. And as it's developed under subsequent court state rulings, all 40 million citizens, every man, woman, child, baby in California can sue any project they want anonymously with no statute of limitations, which basically creates 40 million potential veto points for any attempt to build anything in the state of California. You may have heard, because this hit the national news, but Berkeley wanted to add about 2,000–3,000 students. It's an elite university. Everybody wants to get into Berkeley, and so they desperately need to add student seats. The neighbors of Berkeley, who are pretty upper middle class, wealthy residents of the area surrounding the university, sued under CEQA and won basically on the grounds that these extra students were an industrial pollutant that were degrading the quality of their local environment. I mean, there's a lot of CEQA horror stories. Like the other thing about California that reminded me of the presentation about the invasive species in Pennsylvania is that authority in California is unbelievably fragmented. So we have 58 counties, 481 municipalities, 3,400 special districts that handle things like waste management, water, environmental cleanup. and so forth. And it means that power is delegated to a very and you can't deal with these environmental issues on such a fragmented basis. There's another sequel horror story where there's a 4-mile stretch to connect the 410 freeway to the 5 that comes out of the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. Right now we're facing this supply chain disruption. Ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles are the 2 biggest ports on the West Coast that handle a very large volume of foreign imports into the United States. They've been trying to build this 4-mile stretch of freeway since 1969, but the city of South Pasadena under CEQA has been suing it consistently. Every governor of California has tried to get this thing built, and now, so what is it, from 1970 to the present, 50 years later, Gavin Newsom finally took it out of the budget because he just figured it's not going to happen, and it's one city that's, that's blocking it. All right, so all of this is much more detail about California than you ever wanted to know, but a lot of states have this problem. A lot of democratic countries have this problem. You've had a lot of big infrastructure screw-ups in Europe. Berlin International Airport, the 5th runway at Heathrow. I mean, there's a lot of cases where democracies really have trouble getting to collective action, where there is a public good that needs to be provided, but because of the privileging of particular stakeholders in a political system that tries to balance collective interests against, individual stakeholder interests, the balance has shifted in many democracies towards the protection of as broad a collection of stakeholder interests as possible. So when I think about how do we improve institutions for, in the first instance, adapting, but also mitigating climate change, I don't think about China. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's not an option that's on the table. It's not an option that should be on the table for, any other liberal democracy. What I think about is, let's reduce the number of veto points. Let's actually build mechanisms that permit, things that are in a broad general interest to be negotiated and agreed upon more readily with adequate information. The information side of this is something that's really important. As you know, the internet has really scrambled our neurons in terms of processing basic factual information. So things that we at one point could have agreed upon in terms of what is the actual environmental impact of this particular policy or this particular project is very easy to undermine because of the sort of distrust that has been weaponized on the internet. And so that's also a problem that's preventing us from getting to some of these solutions. But in any event, that's the category of institutional changes that I think we ought to focus on, because we are going to have to make some really big choices in the future. And I think that democracies, so one distinction I think is important to make is that between deciding that it's important to act on an environmental issue and the actual ability to implement the results of that decision. I think that empirically, there is nothing that gives authoritarian regimes an advantage in the first category. There's no reason to think that just because you're authoritarian, you're going to prioritize environment over, let's say, economic growth. There is potentially a problem in terms of implementation. Once a society decides that it actually wants to make something a priority, can you actually get the thing done? And that's where I think there's a real problem in many democracies because of the way that we have multiplied veto points and reduced the possibility for collective action. And I think, we don't need to change the system fundamentally. I think we need to make an adjustment in that balance between, those two objectives. So that's it. Look forward to questions you have. Thank you for listening.
We will have some baskets coming around to collect your papers and questions, and then we'll pass those on forward. So
we're doing these cards so that we can have him. He's the only thing that's recording right now. So with this microphone. So just go ahead and pass the card.
yeah, I will send a basket down. I will also just Any regards that you have for questions?
Or I could repeat the question if somebody wants.
Okay.
All right, so if you want to just raise your hand and ask, I'll.
He's bringing the card.
Okay, he's bringing, okay.
Over here?
Something else.
Will I just shout out?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay, so I'm the director of the USA Innovation Lab and current American Press for Crops, and obviously climate change is the biggest threat we have. I'm also a former UN staff member, and all of my experiences with government or agencies is exactly recounting what you say, both in terms of short-term incentives, but also in the context of this Pascal-Stein idea of sludge. So you're talking about authoritarian regime versus democracy, but governance depends on the consent of the governed. So I'd like to hear your ideas on the role of community effective action, particularly in things like monitoring and large collective structures. So we're reaching about 15 million farmers a week, and what we're finding is they have the greatest incentive for adaptation, clearly, but also perhaps the greatest possibility for mitigation, because that collective action allows us to do things that California can't.
I'm sorry, what, and where is this that you're speaking?
So I'm at USA.
Yeah. No, but in the United States, globally.
So the big problem with climate change
Yeah,
being now faced by those who contribute to the leaks. So Somalia has 7 million people facing famine currently.
yeah.
The question is, you framed it as governance, democracy, America versus China. But what about the government? And you talked about.
Well, no, okay, no, I'm not framing it as the US versus China. I think, yeah, so I think that that is a false dichotomy. What I was trying to argue is that within the universe of countries that we consider liberal and democratic, there's huge variance. And there's actually, frankly, variance among authoritarian countries, so that, you know, China is much more responsive to public opinion than is North Korea, let's say. So those kinds of variances exist also. And what I think is important is actually the concrete mechanisms by which you translate those demands that are coming from civil society, from your population, into actual policy. That's what a political institution is supposed to do. It's supposed to allow people with divergent interests and passions to mobilize, to express those interests, and then have the political system actually translate that into concrete policy action. It can be done, you know, in theory by even an authoritarian regime. They can be responsive to greater or lesser degrees, but democracy is built around this idea that, you know, it should be, you know, at the core of the procedures. The problem in many democracies, including the United States, is unequal representation, right? So that you get certain entrenched interest groups that simply do not give up on, you know, those privileges and therefore don't represent larger currents. Now, frankly, in a lot of countries, it's farmers that are that way. I mean, farmers get subsidized in Europe, you know, by the Common Agricultural Policy. In California, we do things like flood agriculture. We grow rice, you know, and cotton in California because there are certain agricultural interests that have senior water rights that they got, you know, when their great-great-grandparents migrated to California sometime in the 19th century. And so that's also a distortion of representation that, you know, somehow needs to be overcome if you're actually going to have a democratic system that does reflect, you know, the interest of that mass of people. So that's all I'm saying, is that you got to focus on those institutional mechanisms for translating, you know, the popular demands into actual action. Okay, so with that, let me start looking on. There's a lot. All right. How can you reduce veto points in a system full of veto points? Okay, well, so I would say in the United States, there's some veto points that are built into the Constitution, and you're not going to be able to do, you know, very much about it, like the whole system of federalism and the overrepresentation of small states and that sort of thing you can't do anything about. But there's plenty of veto points that are there just as a result of ordinary legislation. Like the stupidest one, in my view, is the fact that every individual senator of the 100 senators in the United States can put a hold on a federal nomination and use it as a way of extorting something from the current administration. So every administration we've had for the last, 7, 8, 9 have had, an average wait time for a confirmation of a secretary or an assistant secretary. I don't know, 6 months. Sometimes it stretches into, more than a year. It's crazy. What kind of country does something like that, right? CEQA is something that they've been trying to reform ever since it was passed, basically. It's very hard to do, actually, because a lot of CEQA is not the result of it's not the legislation, it's a result of the interpretation of it by the California court system. And rolling that back actually is quite hard, but in theory, it's not impossible because it's not involving a constitutional change. And so there are ways that you can greatly simplify decision-making in ways, I think, that will, reduce the number of veto points. You don't want to get rid of them because you do want, certain groups to be able to express their view that something shouldn't happen. But you just need to keep that in proportion so that you can actually do collective action. All right. Are veto points necessary for, hang on a second, necessary for democracies to survive? I find it hard to imagine a democratically elected dictator up for election every 4 years. No, so yes, the answer is yes. Sure, you need veto points, right? You need a Supreme Court. I mean, I'd say this carefully in light of the recent decisions that have come out, but you actually do need a constitutional court that can say, no, to a leader, you've exceeded your authority and our Constitution actually does not permit you to do this. You need, I think federalism in general is a good thing because there are many decisions that are better, especially in a big, diverse society, that are better taken at a state, local, municipal level than at a national level. So those kinds of veto points, I think, are important. It's all a matter of balance, right? Because you also need collective action. And I think you particularly need collective action in these environmental things because an environmental consequence doesn't stay within the boundaries of a particular, small region. It affects, much larger areas. And so you need a way of aggregating those interests into something broader. Okay. How to improve global climate change governance given rising populism? How do you adjust? Well, again, how do you adjust veto points? So rising global populism is a kind of separate set of issues that plays into this because most populists don't take environmental issues seriously, like, Bolsonaro in Brazil. That's a big problem. I think that, actually, not my last book, but the book I published in 2018 on identity was trying to unpack what was behind a lot of the right-wing populism that you see all over the world. And I think that, my conclusion was that it really had to do with less economic, economic inequality was one of the problems because the globalized economy had left a lot of people behind, particularly working class people in rich countries. However, that didn't really explain the totality of the phenomenon, which was largely, in my view, cultural. And it had to do with, the discomfort at the disruption of certain traditional values that were felt by, a certain sociology of people that tended to live not in big cities, but in more rural areas, second and third tier, places. And there was also a certain legitimacy to that because there was a kind of, arrogance on the part of the people that did live in those big cities with good educations, towards the views and attitudes of people that weren't like them. And so there, if you're going to deal with populism, you've got to appreciate, what was driving it, but you also had to stand firm against, the points at which it was a real threat to democracy. I don't think we can solve that problem in this conference, but I do think that, you know, it's a big elephant in the room. And if you have populist politicians like Bolsonaro, that it's not just that he doesn't care about environment, he wants to do the exact wrong things and you know, disrupt all of Gus's, you know, forest rangers that are trying to save, you know, the rainforest. That's a big problem. And that's just a political fight. You've got to fight independently. All right. Well, okay. So again, if we reduce veto points to its limit, we'll have autocracy. Is that the ideal form? No, no. If there's one takeaway from what I'm saying, it's that that's not the conclusion, right? I mean, if you think about it, a perfect dictatorship has one veto point, which is the Hitler or Stalin or whoever is at the top of that hierarchy. You do not want to move to that situation. You need veto points. The question of, again, is one of balance, because if you let every, let's say, rich coastal resident, okay, let me give you another concrete example from California. So high-speed rail from LA to San Francisco will probably have beneficial impacts by getting people out of their cars and off of airplanes, so forth. My prediction is it'll never be built. It'll never be built because of CEQA and because of the way that we make decisions in California. But to give you a concrete example, the single richest zip code in the United States is the city of Atherton, which is just north of where I live, just north of Palo Alto. So the high-speed rail was supposed to come up the old Caltrain route up the peninsula to the 4th Street station in San Francisco. Actually, they're going to build a new station. But these rich people in Atherton didn't like the idea of this noisy train coming through their nice leafy neighborhood. And so they sued under CEQA, and now the train is going to come up to just before Atherton. It's going to cross over into the East Bay. It's going to go up the East Bay, then it's going to come back into San Francisco. You know, does that make sense? No, right? I don't think that they should have a veto over, you know, the design of this train. And this is one area where in China, this would never in a million years happen, right? Because there's going to be somebody at a higher level of authority that's actually going to be able to design the system, you know, in a more efficient and rational way. But when you distribute veto points, you know, to individual small municipalities, the ones that are richer and better organized are going to use that ability to organize to get their way, and they're going to stop things that really shouldn't be stopped. Okay. Let's see. Okay, you argue that the supranational decision-making entity would be dangerous and not the best approach to address climate change. However, we do have the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals, a decision body decision in terms of climate and fostering sustainability, what role the UN takes. So I don't want you to think that I'm arguing against, you know, the COP process or the United Nations or any existing international body. I think that, as I said, you know, the major impact of the COP process, I think, really has been in making people aware that climate is a real issue, that and it's a way of forcing national leaders to think about it, put it on their agenda, even if they don't act on it. I'm arguing something a little bit different, which is that the real solutions to the problem are not going to come out of this international process. Because the real obstacles are, you know, these obstacles to national level decision-making that, you know, are unable to take on vested interests, are unable to convince voters, are unable to, you know, move very rigid decision-making systems. And I just think that that's where we need to spend a little bit more time and effort. Okay, I'm going to skip over the veto point questions because I obviously hit a nerve there. Well, here's an interesting one. Is the expansion of vetocracy the inevitable consequence of democratic political economy? I don't think so. I actually think that, again, if you look across different democracies, they simply don't have as many veto points as the United States. There are vetted historical reasons, including this long-term anti-statism, right? There's one thing about American political culture that's been constant since the founding of the Republic. It's distrust of the centralized state power. And that exists both on the right and the left in different forms. And other countries just don't have it. I mean, you go to, Korea or Japan, or you go to France or Germany and you say, well, do you trust the government to do the right thing? And a lot of people say, yeah. China, I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, I don't know how many conversations I've had with Chinese colleagues where you say, well, do you trust the government what it's doing? So yeah, they're pretty smart people. Heard an American say that. So I do think that, that kind of anti-statism is what breeds veto points, because every individual wants to be able to make this heroic stand against, tyrannical government. But sometimes, that government actually needs to do stuff that is important, and therefore you need to reduce veto points. All right, if there's an alien invasion tomorrow, we'll definitely bypass many veto points and create collective action. Is declaration of war the only solution? So this is actually where the Kim Stanley Robinson book is actually kind of helpful, because, and my colleague at Stanford, he's about to publish a new book about, the politics of mobilizing people for resilience, because different kinds of disasters have different kinds of effects. So a hurricane that breaches the levees in New Orleans motivates a lot of action, right? So after Katrina, there was a lot of investment by the Corps of Engineers to rebuild the levees and the flood walls. The big flood in the Netherlands in whenever it was 53 or 54, led to these huge investments, in protecting the port of Rotterdam against a future flood of that scale. But as Bruce points out, something like droughts are much, much harder to mobilize against because they are episodic. And even when you're in the middle of a drought, it's not as if, your water is going to get cut off tomorrow. I mean, you just get these, announcements that you can't water your lawn and, you shouldn't flush your toilet as much and this sort of thing, but it doesn't create this active sense of crisis, even though in the long run it is, a very severe crisis. And that's one of the problems, is that many of the things that happen under climate change are so slow moving that unless it's illustrated in a very dramatic way, like Hurricane Sandy, it's just not going to penetrate people's consciousness. And I'm not quite sure how to get around this. It's possible that we'll just have to wait for more disasters to happen that will make this thing much more vivid to people, which I guess is the equivalent of an alien invasion. Much more time, 5 more minutes. All right, let's see how many of these I can. How do you account for the rise of extreme right? Well, I've tried to answer that in part already. How do you propose to tackle the problem of climate change, reducing veto? Yeah, have you done that one? How do you think the possible end? Oh, this is a good one. How do you think the possible end to Chevron by the Supreme Court? They announced that decision, that West Virginia versus EPA decision today. They did announce it?
It's on the docket. I don't think they made that.
Yeah, okay. So people are expecting that to come down this week. So I actually just completed this long article about bureaucratic autonomy and bureaucratic discretion. So if you're not familiar with Chevron deference, this was a 1983-84 Supreme Court decision, Chevron versus National or Environmental Defense Council, that basically said that if Congress was not clear in its delegation of power to an administrative agency, but the decision of the agency looked like it was a reasonable one, that the court should defer to that agency's judgment. And that is what's given the EPA running room in order to interpret existing law in a more expansive way that's allowed them to do things like regulate methane and so forth. And the worry is that Gorsuch and Thomas and some of the other conservative justices on the current court have targeted Chevron deference, Gorsuch in particular, and said that, you know, this is an excessive deference to bureaucrats and therefore should be eliminated. The whole question, I think, that we're going to have to look at when that decision comes down is how narrowly they've interpreted this. If they get rid of Chevron deference altogether, I mean, the most extreme form of it, which some conservatives believe, is that Congress actually doesn't even have the right to delegate anything, right? So can you imagine our Congress in Washington deciding how many parts per million of a particular toxic chemical is adequate, you know, and should be controlled? I mean, it's just an absurd proposition. So there's a milder form of reining in Chevron deference that would expand the, there's another doctrine that makes exceptions to that deference, and you can expand the number of those cases. It's, what is it, the important questions doctrine, something like that. So there are different ways. So you have to look very carefully at the decision, because in its more extreme forms, it will basically make most forms of regulation in the United States impossible, not just environmental regulation, but many other forms of regulation as a whole. I somehow can't believe that even this court is going to go that far, but exactly how much constraint it places on agency rulemaking, you know, we'll have to see. And okay, I got one more minute, so I can do one more question. Let's see. I shouldn't have talked about veto points. All of these questions are about veto points. How do you assess risk opportunities for political institutions? Oh, okay, so this is a good one. How do you assess the risks and opportunities of political institutions falling far behind economic, technological changes? Well, obviously, that's been a big problem for everybody. You know, in part, I mean, it gets to the prior question about Chevron deference. Part of the reason that you want bureaucratic agencies is that they have the expertise to at least remotely keep up with the kinds of technological changes. So most of the rulemaking that are done by administrative agencies is in response to technological change, right? Something like net neutrality wouldn't come up if there weren't an internet, but now the FCC has to make rules about, you know, how do we regulate cyberspace, and it's only that deference to agency rulemaking that allows you to even remotely, you know, adjust to kind of technological change. If you had to rely on this polarized Congress to actually make new rules because there's a new technology like social media suddenly hit the world, and you have to rely on Congress to, you know, figure out how to do media curation, forget about it. It's not going to happen, right? And so the old system was not adequate, I think, to keep up. I do think that, you know, you probably need specialized bureaucracies. You know, for example, at Stanford, I ran a working group, a Stanford working group on platform scale to actually look at this question of content moderation and how you deal with the big platforms. And we and a lot of other people came up with the view that you need a specialized digital regulator, because the FTC and the Justice Department that currently have authority over this just don't have the technical capacity. You know, federal government cannot hire a computer programmer and pay them a competitive salary. They just can't under the current civil service rules. And so I think that, you know, governments are always going to be behind, but they're not going to be able to keep up unless you can actually create the capacity, you know, within the federal bureaucracy to actually, you know, have the technical expertise to deal with a lot of these changing technologies. All right, I guess we're at the end. Thank you.